Welcome to Informer 5 training on Teams and user access. Had a lot of folks asking about security and how to set that up within Informer, so hopefully this will provide you the information you need. Just to kind of give you an overview of the topics we're going to cover today. First, we want to talk a little bit about data governance and what that is, and sort of how Informer then goes on to provide that. We'll talk about users and teams, ownership and sharing, and how you can collaborate within Informer. So first of all, what is data governance? That's become a term that's been used quite a lot lately with all these disparate sources of data and the proliferation of data and all the different applications that are storing data. What is data governance? Well, the purpose of data governance is to ensure a high data quality throughout the life cycle of the data, and that the access to that data is then controlled and monitored. The ultimate end, of course, being that there's a single source of truth for data across the entire organization. That way, users can go to a single point and get the data that they need and trust that data and know that that data is valid. So we're going to see how the teams and users work to incorporate data governance into Informer. So first, let's talk about users and teams. Users and teams are used to define ownership of content. It also allows you to share content within Informer, and then also control access to any sensitive information that you may have in your data sources. And as far as users go, there are two types of users. We have a normal user in which all of the security applies to them. Any security settings get applied to their user when they're logged into Informer. The super user is a system administrator account, so the rules don't apply to them. They have full access to everything within Informer, all data, all functionality, just like the admin account within Informer. So those are going to be limited to your administrators and those folks who need to have that full broad access. So the majority of your users will be normal. Sources for those users can be either local, so you can manage them locally within Informer, create and manage the accounts within Informer, or you can import them from LDAP or Active Directory, or you can also use SAML for single sign-on to source your users, or if you have some other user repository that you want to use for authentication, you can have a plugin that connects to that user repository and authenticates users that way. Teams are then functional groupings of those users. And again, just like with users, they can be sourced from a number of different places, either locally, again, managed locally within Informer, or they can be imported from LDAP or Active Directory, or you can, again, connect to some other external resource to provide that team definition. And then within each team, those users who belong to the team have a particular role. And there are 5 main roles that a user can have. Starting at the bottom, which is the very basic type of role, is the member role. Then above that is designer, data wizard, publisher, and then the team administrator or admin, which is not to be confused with the Informer admin. That does not give them system administrator privileges. We'll see what it gives them a little bit later on. So the member role is the very basic, sort of the baseline entry-level role that a user can have. Users who are in the member role can only consume content. They can't create anything new within Informer. They can only consume what's been shared to the team, and they can also use data sets that are available to the team and use Discover to build some visuals and pivot tables. But those are not something that they can save. It's just, again, they're just building those and consuming those. So it's kind of like a read-only level access into the content. The designer role is the next level up. So as we go up this list of roles, each one builds on the previous one. So the designer role then adds the ability to create any content from data sets that are available to the team. They can also create their own data sets from spreadsheets. They're not able to create them from other sources of data like databases, but they can upload spreadsheets and create data sets from those spreadsheets. And then designers are also able to create ad hoc queries. The next role from that then is the data wizard. The data wizard has all the rights of the designer, with the ability to create data sets from other data sources. So they're able to create any kind of data set available. They're able to edit any data sets that are owned by the team. They're able to create workspaces, and workspaces are just a special area within data sources that allows you to upload your spreadsheet data. It's another way of getting spreadsheet data into Informer, but we basically upload that into a SQL table and then create like a little small database within Informer that you can link those tables together that are sourced from spreadsheets and be able to treat them like a SQL database. And lastly, the data wizard is able to create a job, which allows them to schedule like refreshes of data sets or that kind of thing. So they are able to create jobs. The next level up then is the publisher role. And really the only thing that the publisher role adds is the ability to share content that is owned by the team. So far, we've been able to create content, but nobody below the publisher role is able to share it outside of the team that they're a member of. The publisher role has to do that. So that adds that level of data governance to make sure that the content's verified before it's then shared out to any other teams. The publisher role can only share out like data sets and reports. They can't share out data sources. That is for the admin role to do, or one of the super user roles, super user accounts. And then lastly, we have the admin role, which should not be confused with the admin user within Informer. This is the team admin. So a person who is the admin or administrator of their team is able to manage who is on their team. If there are any data sources that are owned by the team, the admin can share that data source out to other teams. An admin can also create their own data sources as well, so create other connections to databases. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about the roles and kind of gone through those, and I've mentioned a couple of times about team-owned content, team-owned data sources, and so forth. So that brings us to the topic of ownership and sharing. Within Informer 5, ownership is done at either the user or team level. Teams or users are able to own content. That's different if you're familiar with Informer 4, only users could own content. Now we've added another layer there that allows an entire team to own content. And that adds credibility to that content. It says that this data has been reviewed, this content has been reviewed, that it has been verified, and it is following standards and so forth for use within the organization. So we make sure that everything is good to go. If a user owns content, then only that user can modify it. No one else on their team is able to modify that content. But once ownership is then given to the team, then the role within the teams that we went through earlier, the role defines who can modify that content. So that's ownership. Sharing is different from ownership. Sharing can only be done to teams. You can't share to individuals. The sharing can only be done at the team level. And the role then defines what the user can do with the content that is shared to that team, but it is read-only. Sharing does not provide any kind of modification rights. So I could share content to another team, and they would be able to view that content and consume that content, but they would not be able to modify it in any way, regardless of the role within the team that it is shared to. So just a few things to note on sharing particular content. So when you're sharing data sources, this allows users on the team to which the data source is shared to create data sets and ad hoc queries from that data source. This does not affect, however, access to shared data sets, and we'll talk about that in just a second. And sharing data sources also allows you to control what level of access members or users in that team to restricted fields or restricted data. So that's where we can get into controlling what data they have access to. So a restricted field allows you to control access to any kind of sensitive data that you might have, Social Security number, for example, or payroll data or whatever. And what that does is if the team that the user is a member of does not have access to restricted fields within the data source that they're working with, they will never see that field listed anywhere. They will not even know it exists. So when you share out a data source, you're given the option of which level of access they have. So limited access means that they do not have access to any restricted fields within that data source. Full access gives them access to all of the fields within the data source. And then you can do a little bit more granular control of which restricted fields they have through use of what we call mapping sets and custom access. So a mapping set is just a logical grouping of mapping. So as in the example I show here, we have 3 different mapping sets, one for financial aid files, one for HR files, and one for student files. So I've logically grouped those in the data source, all the files that go into those sets, and associated them with those sets so that when I then share using the custom access, I can specify which level of access to restricted data they have in those mapping sets. So here I'm saying that the team I'm sharing this data source to has no access to restricted fields within the files I've identified with financial aid. They have no access whatsoever to any of the files within the HR set of mappings, and they have full access to all of the fields within the files I've identified under the student mapping. So I'm able to do that control a little bit more granularly this way. And then on to sharing data sets. As I mentioned earlier, when you share a data set, you do not have to concurrently give access to the data source that the data set is based on. You're sharing the data itself. When you're doing that, they don't have any ability to go in and modify that data set or even refresh that data set. They have to be on the team that owns it in order to be able to do that. So sharing a data set does not require the data source to be shared along with it. You can also, in the sharing of the data set, specify whether they have access to all the records within the data set, or you can apply a filter to this sharing to say this team only has access to a subset of the records within that data set. And then sharing of reports is just simply giving access to those reports for users to be able to access them. There's not really anything beyond that. There's no additional layer of security there. They either have access to the report or they don't, and then they can interact with that. And of course, ad hoc queries is one of the special use case reports. Here, you're not actually sharing the data when you're sharing to a team. You're sharing the query because that ad hoc query has to be ran in order to get the data. So in that instance, you do have to also share the data source to the team along with the ad hoc query. So you have to make sure they have both access to both the data source being used by the ad hoc query and the ad hoc query itself. So a typical workflow for creating content or using this sharing mechanism would be, let's say I'm a data wizard on a team and I'm going to create a data set. And I build it out to the way I think I like it and that I'm satisfied with it. I've checked it and said, okay, it's ready to go. So then I would, in turn, give ownership of that data set to my team. And then at that point, the team would collaborate on that content, and we'll talk about collaboration in the next couple of slides here. The team would collaborate on my data set content and suggest any changes that needed to be made or anything that would need to be adjusted maybe I'm not pulling the data correctly, or I'm pulling a wrong field or something like that. They could tell me what I need to change on that. And then once the changes have been made, the publisher could be notified and said, okay, this is ready to go, and they could then share, that publisher could share that data set then to other teams if they needed access to it. So talking about collaboration, what am I talking about there? So Informer does have a collaboration component in it, in that I'm able to work with my team to build content, and we can work together to make sure that this content is correct and that it is valid and that it has integrity and that it's ready to go for public consumption. So you can do things, for example, like add comments to content. So like in our previous example, when we're building that data set, once I've given ownership to the team can go on and access it, view it. They can add comments to that content. And then I would then see those comments show up in my newsfeed on my homepage. And then I'm able to go in and respond to those comments, or I can make adjustments to that data set as recommended, whatever. So that allows that layer of collaboration in building out content. So as we've seen, the teams and users within Informer allows you to control and track access to data and what functionality the users have with the data once they have access to it. And it helps to ensure that the data we're sharing is of high quality and provides a layer of integrity that we know when we're using it to build content, we can trust that data. Okay, so I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon for this webinar. If you do have any questions, feel free to send those in to us. We'll be happy to answer those. You can email either your sales representative, or you can send your questions to our support line, which is i5support@intrinsic.com. And we look forward to talking to you again soon. Look forward to seeing and hearing all of the great things that you're doing with Informer 5.